Alrighty, well, welcome to class today, and we will begin to see if you have any questions, comments, concerns about last class. If anybody has any of that, please speak now or forever hold your peace.
What are we speaking about?
We are speaking about if anybody has any questions over last class. If there are none, we're going to move into the second part of the book of Jonah today, and I've entitled this class, When Pagans Outshine Believers. And I was going to have just sheets of the verses in front of you because it was going to make it probably a little bit easier on our class today. Chapter 1, verses 4 through 16 is what I'm hoping to cover today. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and such a mighty storm came up upon the sea that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried to his God. They threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. Jonah, meanwhile, had gone down into the hold of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. The captain came and said to him, "What are you doing sound asleep? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps the God will spare us a thought so that we do not perish." The sailors said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots so that we may know on whose account this calamity has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us why this calamity has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you?" There's a lot of questions in just a short period of time. Jonah says, "I am a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were even more afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them so. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you that the sea may quieten down for us?" For the sea was growing more and more tempestuous. He said to them, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea. Then the sea will quieten down for you, for I know it is because of me that this great storm has come upon you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to bring the ship back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more stormy against them. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, O Lord, we pray, do not let us perish on account of this man's life. Do not make us guilty of innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So they picked Jonah up and threw him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord even more, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. Does anything strike you about this text before we kind of start digging into it? Does anybody have any initial kind of reactions, comments, questions, or what have you to this part of the story? Anyone? Ruth is, I do, let me talk.
So all I know about Jonah is,
I don't know.
It was on. Unless somebody turned it off.
So what strikes me is it sounds like the other people on the boat were not Hebrew.
Yes.
And now they are going to pray to Jonah's God.
Yes.
That strikes me as odd.
Strikes you as odd.
It does.
Yeah.
Maybe not anyone else, but it strikes me odd.
We'll get into that. Hold that thought. I think that's a good observation. Very good observation. Anybody else have any observations or thoughts they'd like to kind of just put forward? Rick, yes.
I always was kind of concerned that Jonah actually gave himself up, that he said, "Well, it's my fault." I mean, as much as he didn't like any of this, it just seemed that he would have kept quiet rather than admit that, "Oh, it's me, just throw me in the sea and you'll be fine."
Well, remember the lot fell on him. That's the other
Okay,
part of the story there, and that we'll actually get to that because that was really interesting. I didn't really know how that worked until I studied the text this week. So, but the lot fell on him. So it wasn't just, okay, it's all my fault. It was like there were all these series of events that everybody knew it was him. I mean, everything pointed to him, and so he was the guilty party. There's no doubt about that. But thanks for the observation. Appreciate it. if there are no others, we're going to start digging into this text, and I'm going to kind of go a little bit verse by verse on this with some of the commentary, and we'll work through it, and hopefully we'll get to kind of the application and stuff like that at the end. So kind of bear with it. It may feel a little dry, may feel a little deep, but it's okay. I mean, we'll get to some application about what this text is saying. I think it's fascinating. So as we go into this, just bear with me on that. It's notable in verse 4 at the very beginning that the word in Hebrew that is translated hurled actually is like through. So it's the same word that's used throughout this little passage when the sailors threw the cargo overboard and when the sailors threw Jonah overboard. So you get the picture that God is sitting there, throwing the wind. That's kind of what the text indicates, is that God is throwing the wind at the sea and causing the sea to rise up against the boat. Which for me is kind of fascinating. So what does that say? Does that have any kind of implications in regards to things? What does that kind of say? Does anybody have any thoughts? I mean, other than the obvious that God kind of has this supernatural control over the weather and events that are going on. But it's also kind of an uncomfortable thought at times. Because then it's like, oh, well, are all storms caused this way? Is God doing all of that kind of stuff in one way or the other? That kind of raises some interesting questions and implications in my mind. I don't know about y'all's. But I just kind of found the imagery fascinating of God throwing the wind at the sea. Kind of interesting. Verse 5 presents an interesting contrast, a contrast that is prevalent throughout the rest of the snippet. The sailors who are pagan are all crying out to their gods. They are praying in the midst of the calamity. So they are beseeching their gods. They are saying, save us and what have you. And what is Jonah doing? Sleeping. Here is the prophet of the Most High God, the one who is running from God, the one who's the cause of the storm, who has put others in danger because of his running, sleeping, in a sense being unfaithful, and the pagans are the one being faithful. That's quite an interesting contrast in the midst of this book. And so like the Jewish readers would hear this and go, wait a minute here. Why do the pagans pray? And why is the prophet sleeping? That's what they would be asking. Jonah's sleeping here is the same type of sleep that God caused Adam to fall into to remove his rib and create Eve. Same word that was used way back in Genesis chapter 2 is now used here in the book of Jonah. It's this kind of really, really deep sleep. The commentaries here are interesting. Stewart says, Jonah's deep sleep, therefore, can hardly be evidence that he was uncaring or irresponsible, as the rest of the narrative makes clear, but rather that he was out cold. So kind of after running, Alan's comment here leads us... Stewart's comment here leads us to wonder if Jonah has fallen asleep because he is relieved that he has finally escaped God and the word that God gave to him. So I put the wrong word there. I'm going to have to correct that. I have two commentaries, Alan and Stewart, and I messed them up there. My bad. I apologize for that. But it leads me to say, okay, Jonah has been running from God. He is scared to death of doing what God has told him. And so he gets to the boat. He thinks he's safe. And what happens? He's like passes out. I mean, have you ever been at that kind of top point in your life? I mean, have you ever gone through a time of deep stress and worry and anxiousness, and suddenly it's resolved? It's finally done. It's finally over. Then what do? What does your body do? Sometimes it just collapses. I remember at my first congregation, I was getting towards the end of my tenure there, and we've been going through a really, really rough time and what have you, and some conflict and everything, and I was doing my best to try to put an end to it and stuff like that. It wasn't working. I'd been running myself ragged. I didn't know whether or not it was time for me to move on or not. And my in-laws were celebrating their anniversary, and they took us on a cruise. And removed myself from the situation. When I talk about removing self from the situation, we didn't depart out of Galveston. They flew us to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And we left out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So I was hundreds and hundreds of miles away from the situation, far removed from it, got on a boat, got into the middle of the sea. And I think Donna and I both slept for a full day. We were out cold. Our bodies just let go of the stress. We relaxed. And we were able to kind of... And so, if that's the case, there isn't really anything malicious here, at least at this point. But it still, I think, tells us a little bit of something about the pagans and Jonah. What do you think it tells us about Jonah and the pagans here, about those two, how different they are? God, y'all are quiet today. Does it say anything at all?
I think Jonah had trust that things would work out.
Or that he was far enough away that
Yeah.
he didn't have to worry about it anymore. That he was completely unconcerned with kind of the real world situation and what was going on. I mean, I think some of this begins to have some implications with the church at times. Kind of when we get complacent in what we believe and think is going on in the world. In a sense, the question is, should the church ever be fast asleep? Yes or no? I mean, here's Jonah. Okay, I've gotten away with it. I've run from the Lord. I'm completely safe. You know, I'm completely sound. I can just fall asleep and rest. I don't have to worry about doing anything anymore. Everything's done. And here are the pagans praying and fighting the storm while the prophet is asleep. And I mean, I think if we in the church ever find ourselves in that kind of situation where the world is sitting there going after a problem, if the world is going after issues and the world is trying to take care of things while we are just simply resting, sleeping, gathering for worship on a Sunday morning and what have you, then we think we've got things backwards. Things are really topsy-turvy. And so right here we see just some topsy-turviness in the way things should be. And I think it's fascinating to see that the pagans right here are actually acting heroically while Jonah isn't. In verse 6, the captain sees Jonah and says, "Get up, call." Now, interestingly enough, these two verbs are the exact same verbs that God used to call Jonah to go to Nineveh. Think about that a little bit. So one of the commentaries said something to the effect, Jonah must have freaked out hearing these words all of a sudden coming out of the captain. So here's God at the beginning of the chapter says, "Get up, call on Nineveh." And now the captain of the boat says, "Get up, call." You see how the tie is there and kind of the irony of it? There may be some irony there, we don't know for sure. What we do know is the captain is very concerned about the situation. Being pagan, he believes that every person has his or her personal family and national god. So in that time, everyone believed that there was a personal, a family, and then a national god. And it seems like the prayers of all his other sailors aren't working, so maybe this guy's God will actually listen. So the captain is like, okay, we got to cover all the gods. And here's this one person sleeping, not praying, so, none of our prayers are working, so maybe this guy's God can actually help us out. So, Jonah gets up, but interestingly enough, do we have any indication in the text at this point, from your memory, that Jonah started praying, yes or no? No, he doesn't. There's no indication in the text that Jonah actually prays. So they go up and they say, okay, who has caused this calamity? Why is this happening to us? And they cast lots, they threw dice. Now, this was something that I found really interesting. I didn't know how this happened in the ancient world, but the dice were covered with light and dark colors. So you had this cube with light and dark colors, and they would throw them. If you got 2 darks, that meant no, you weren't it. If you got 2 lights that fell on you, that meant yes. And if you got 1 dark, 1 light, that meant roll again. So they went around and they cast lots until, they found out which one it was. And they may have had a little prayer ahead of time saying, show us who is the guilty party. So when they cast the lots, Jonah eventually rolled 2 light-sided deals. And that's how they figured out that he was the responsible one. Go ahead, Rick.
You notice in this thing that Jonah could have probably called on God for help, but he's specifically trying to avoid talking to God.
Yes.
And so rather than ask God to help him, it was better for them to throw him over than for him to ask for help.
And we'll get into that even more, because it gets worse than just that. It does. It gets worse than that, but you're absolutely astute. You're absolutely right, but it gets worse. So interesting. This helps shed some light on me, for me too, because later on in the book of Acts, there's another deal about the casting of lots too. And you have the casting of lots for the disciple who would replace Judas. And so this is what happened there when they were trying to figure out, was it going to be Matthias or Justus? They were trying to figure out which one. And so this was the process that they would have used to figure out which one would replace Judas as the disciple. So it's just fascinating kind of putting all of that together. I really did not know how that happened. So it's like, oh, okay, that helps me understand the text just a little bit more. Now, verse 8 has a lot to consider. Stewart says the 5 questions, and this is what I stopped and I said, that's a lot of questions. So like 5 questions, just boom, 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 boom. Who are you? Where do you come from? What is your occupation? So on and so forth. The 5 questions pressed hurriedly on Jonah while the storm still howls are not mere idle conversation starters. The first question is the most crucial. Its answer is not obvious. The crew quite naturally wonders if somehow they might have done something wrong deserving of this calamity. And the first question was, why is this happening to us? Have they offended Jonah? So that they're wondering if their actions have offended him as the prophet, and they're wondering if his God is mad at them for offending him. So that's one of the questions that they're asking. So they may not necessarily be blaming Jonah himself, but they're thinking, okay, we may have done something to him, and this is why this is happening. Are they helping him do something wrong? That's the next question they're trying to figure out. Maybe they haven't offended him, but maybe he's doing something wrong and his God is trying to punish him. Is it guilt by association? Are they helping him and so they are guilty by association because they know him? Or is Jonah alone to blame? Is he the sole one at fault? Are they transporting someone who's committed a great crime? Or is someone else whom Jonah knows or is associated with the source of the problem? So all of those questions are kind of coming to light in their one question to Jonah about why is this happening. So they're still genuinely wondering why the lot fell on Jonah and what it means for them. The crew is also desperate to know exactly who Jonah is because they know now only that he is somehow the focus of the problem. Until they know his identity, they can hardly expect to know, for example, which God he is offended and how. Thus, the sailors pepper him with all of these urgent questions. So, anybody have any thoughts or comments on that? But do you see why they're doing all that?
Jonah sounds a whole lot like a Lutheran.
Say a little more. What does it mean? He sounds a whole lot like a Lutheran. Why is it? Why do you think he sounds like a Lutheran?
Because he doesn't say anything.
Because he doesn't say anything. That's not true.
Same problem you're having right now.
That's too funny. That is too funny. All right, good deal. Yeah, he doesn't say a whole lot, but then he does finally say, I am a Hebrew. I worship the God who created the land and the sea. That's his deal. So Stewart says this about verse 9. Jonah, by this point, knows all about the suddenness of the storm and has seen God control the lots that have fallen on him. He cannot fail to recognize that his attempt at flight has proved futile. If he has not already told, he is beginning to tell the sailors that he has been fleeing Yahweh. It is time to give up and confess everything. It is an open admission that his God is all-powerful and his will is inescapable. Jonah has resigned himself to being punished by the God he could not outrun, the universal Yahweh. The idea that the storm may be stopped by his death is probably already on his mind. So at this point when he says, I'm a Hebrew, I worship Yahweh, the Most High God, he's making the admission, okay, yeah, this is falling for me, and I can't escape God. Whereas at one point, early on, we discovered last week that he thought he could escape God, that he could get away to a country where God was not known, where no one spoke his name, and he thought he could get away, but he has found out, no, can't escape Yahweh. Yahweh is overall universal. So this is my fault. I've done the wrong thing. And Stuart says that probably Jonah believes the storm will be stopped by his death, but Alan had a very different take on that, and I liked Alan's take better, his commentary. We'll get to that in just a minute, because I was just like, ooh, when I heard it, I was like, oh man, that just kind of rammed some things home. So we'll get that in just a little bit. Stuart continues about verse 10. A paraphrase of their words would be, oh no, you've done that, or even how could you? So their words at this point in the parable were, why have you done this thing? But it's like, really? You've tried to run from your God? How could you do that? Why did you do that? These were religious Canaanite sailors. They knew how serious Jonah's actions were, and they did not like the fact that he had chosen their vessel as his means of flight. The storm was cause enough for fear. Now to be associated with this disobedient prophet, even innocently, it was like being tied up to a person who was calling for a lightning strike to strike him dead. So that's pretty powerful when you think about that. These are religious Canaanite sailors. They are people who are praying to their gods. They just want a safe voyage across the sea, and now they've been associated with this guy who's running from his God, who is very, very powerful, who made the land and the sea, who is able to throw wind. And they're like, you have chained yourself to us and put us in danger because you are fleeing your God. Now, do you think that speaks very highly of Jonah? He is willing to put other people in danger because he's running from God. That's just not cool. That's just not cool. Is there a lesson from that? Because you have to remember, what Jonah is doing is very, very selfish. He's a court prophet who loves Israel. He will not go to Israel's enemies. He's denying God's call to do that. He's focusing only on himself. Yes, Rick.
I don't think that he thought he was going to put anyone in danger. He actually thought he could escape God. So the moment when this happened, he realized he couldn't run away. He was already on the boat.
Okay, yeah, I get that.
Yeah, because as soon as he realizes it, then he's willing for them to throw him over.
We're going to get into that in just a second, because I think that's actually a very selfish act too. That his willingness to throw himself overboard. And no, he's not willing to throw himself overboard. Let's put it that way. He tells the sailors, you have to throw me overboard.
Yes, but he...
Okay,
he still owns up to all of that. I'm with Rick. I think that
right.
He didn't believe, he didn't have any, he probably never gave it a thought that getting on that vessel is going to endanger those other people.
All right, absolutely. He never gave it a thought.
Right.
That it would endanger other people.
Right.
He never gave it a thought. I want you to think about that.
He didn't really believe in God. That's my thinking is, if he did, he would know that you can't run away.
Or he was in denial.
Yes.
I think he believed in God, but I don't think he trusted God. I think that's part of the line of demarcation that I would put on this. Because, and I've said this before in sermons and stuff like that, we can believe in anything, but that doesn't mean we trust it. I mean, I can believe that there's a flying spaghetti monster, but I'm certainly not going to go preach and teach about the flying spaghetti monster. I don't trust in the thing. You know, I believe in politicians.
Yeah.
I trust them. No offense, Randy.
Hey, I agree with you 100%.
But you see the line of demarcation there. I mean, you can believe, but it doesn't mean you have the deep down, deep-seated trust in. And I think Jonah believes in God. I mean, he prophesied for God about expanding Israel's border. We got that from 2 Kings. Remember that? So he believed in God. He believed that he had a prophecy from God, but he didn't want to trust him on this one. He just flat out wanted to deny him, and he ran. And he did not think that his actions would put anyone else in danger. Now, what does that tell us? What does that teach us about our actions? What does that tell us about when we seek to do things? What do we need to try to make sure we do?
It's in God's time and not ours.
Well, there's that, absolutely. But what else do we need to try to consider when we act on something?
Everybody else.
Exactly. What are the consequences of our actions? Sometimes we get so focused on what we want to do that we say, okay, what are the consequences? How does this affect other people? How does this affect, the folks that I love? How does this affect the people that I may come in contact with? Jonah gave no consideration to that. He was so self-centered and so focused on himself and getting away from God, he did not consider what his actions might cause. I think that's something really, really, really important for us to think about when we begin doing things, because we have to think beyond ourselves, beyond our own, self-preservation and our own wants, desires, and perceived needs. And we've got to think, okay, how does this affect other people? We can't just be self-centered. And I think that's part of the message right here. Jonah is very, very self-centered. He's running from God, and he does not take into account how his actions may affect other people. He didn't consider it. And now there are people's lives in jeopardy because of what he's done. That's not a good thing. So in verse 11, the men ask Jonah what they are supposed to do. Now this is interesting. I just really interesting. Because normally when someone puts you in danger, when somebody does something to you that puts your life or your being in danger, are you going to ask them what to do? I mean, really, are you? Okay, you've just put my family in danger. So what do I do to get out of it? No, I ain't going to ask you. I'm going to find somebody else I trust. But the sailors here don't. They ask Jonah for a solution. Why? Because Jonah is both the guilty party and the expert. The pagans here have no knowledge of Yahweh. So they don't know what to do. They know Yahweh is the one hurling the wind. They know Yahweh is the one causing the storm. But they know nothing about him. Who's the only one on the boat that knows anything about Yahweh?
Jonah.
So they're in this kind of predicament where the only one who has the answer is the one who caused the problem. And so they have to ask him. What do we do? Now Stuart says this about verse 12. Jonah's reply is both blunt and shocking. They must kill him. The sailors are of course innocent. Jonah knows that Yahweh is hardly out to punish them. He resignedly offers his own life in this way so that theirs may be spared. Yet Yahweh contemplate his judgment. There's more to this, I think. More that we will cover later. But let me ask you this. Is that the only solution? Is throwing him overboard the only solution? Might there be another?
He could have prayed.
He could have prayed. Yes. Ruth, you're shaking your head. What else could they do?
Well, pray and repent.
Pray and repent. Absolutely. That's part of it. Rick?
Well, if you look back at this, you know that Jonah talks to God and God talks to him. They have a communication line. So he knows that he could talk to God and ask for help, but he's just too stubborn to do it.
Yes, absolutely. Now we're starting to go down that train. We're starting to go down that vein of thought, so just keep that in mind. Throwing him overboard and killing him is not the only solution. And why doesn't he have the guts to jump overboard himself? That's the other question I got to ask. If he knows he's the one who's the problem, and he knows he's the one who has put these other folks' lives in danger, why does he ask them to throw him overboard?
Because then he's still blameless.
He's still blameless. Ruth?
Well, there's an amount of courage there, and he's willing for them to do it, but he doesn't quite have the courage to do it himself.
Yep. Yeah. I'll pawn it off on somebody else. Verse 13 now is fascinating, because verse 13 starts out, they said, nevertheless, they rowed for shore. The pagan sailors don't want to throw Jonah overboard. They are trying to save his life. I want you to think about that for a minute, because Jonah is not willing to cast himself into the sea, but wants to make the pagan sailors throw him into the sea. But they will not kill him. They want to save him. They don't want his blood on their hands. This is the situation that Jonah gives them, but instead of listening to him and committing what to them would be murder, they try to row for shore and place Jonah on the shore. They seem to care about Jonah's life more than he cares for theirs. I find this extremely fascinating and a bit troubling. A prophet of Yahweh puts innocent people's lives in danger because of selfish behavior, only to have the people whose lives he put in danger try to save him. Does anybody else find this troubling? I mean, honestly. And why didn't Jonah just throw himself overboard? Why wasn't he willing to sacrifice himself and instead told others to throw him overboard? When their efforts to reach the shore fail, the sailors resign themselves to casting Jonah in the sea. They are worried about this. They don't want to do it. So they pray to Yahweh. Let that sink in a minute. Jonah won't pray to Yahweh. They do. And they ask for forgiveness. Remember, the captain of the ship beseeched Jonah to pray for your God. There's no record of Jonah praying to Yahweh. There's no record of asking him for forgiveness or asking Yahweh to spare the sailors. Jonah doesn't pray. The pagan sailors do. They ask for forgiveness, and they hurl Jonah into the sea. And verse 16 indicates that these men are so taken aback, because when they throw Jonah into the sea, the wind stops, the sea goes calm. They're so taken aback by what they experienced that they added Yahweh to their list of gods to worship. The text does not say that they became Jews, but they certainly came to respect and believe in the power of Yahweh. They began to do the things that Jonah should have done. They did what Yahweh demanded when Jonah did not. You see why I entitled the study, When Pagans Outshine Believers. So Jonah all of a sudden becomes, in a sense, the anti-hero, the enemy. The pagans here become the heroes. And for the early Jews to see this, they would have been like, whoa. Whoa. That's unreal. Stewart made the following observation. To be a prophet was not necessarily to be a great theologian. God chooses whom he will, whether trained professional specialists or not, to proclaim his word. Jonah may have thought his desperate run from God's call might succeed. He may have assumed it would fail, but decided irrationally to try it anyway. His flight may have been carefully planned, or it may have been hastily undertaken. He may have thought of it as permanent or as merely temporary. Regardless of the actual details, unknowable as they are, the simple fact remains, Jonah chose disobedience over obedience because the former was less odious to him than the latter. So here we see Stewart saying, okay, Jonah may not be a person of really great intellect. He might not be a person of very high logic. He doesn't think through things too well. He doesn't think through his beliefs in God too well. But for God, that's not a criteria of the call. The criteria of the call is obedience. And for Jonah, that was sorely lacking. It was more palatable for him to be disobedient and reject any logical understanding of who God was than for him to be actually obedient. Yes, Herbie. yeah, Herbie, go ahead. Yeah, and I've got a response to that, but I just...
What about Jonah? So no?
Yeah, that's all.
Good enough.
About looking at him as an evangelist. Because look at all the people he changed by his action, by his lack of action.
Anybody want to respond to that before I do? Pauline?
I think God showed Jonah as an example. Maybe.
Yeah. But who's the ones who's... Oh, go ahead, Rick.
I think through this book, we're going to see that God works in spite of Jonah.
Ah, yes, absolutely.
Jonah
Because who's
is
the one...
almost the foil.
Who's the ones whose actions here actually changed those sailors? Yeah, because Jonah's running, Jonah's sleeping, Jonah's not praying, Jonah's not really saying much. God's the one hurling the wind. God's the one who makes the wind stop. So they see what God was doing, and they saw what Jonah was doing, and it wasn't Jonah that impressed them. Who impressed them?
Would they have seen God if it hadn't been for Jonah?
Yeah, you're right. They wouldn't have seen God unless it would have been for Jonah. You're right. And which is, again, one of those things that is very, very intriguing to see how God's work works in spite of our sinfulness. Which, oh God, I can't. Because I get to that in just a minute. Okay, I did it. Okay, I think we see, to be a prophet does not necessarily mean you are a great theologian. I think we see that with Jonah. I think we also see a prophet who is devoid of faith. Again, faith meaning trust, not necessarily belief. Jonah certainly believes in God and Yahweh. There's no doubt about that. Does he trust Yahweh? Does he understand what it means to follow Yahweh? Does he really wish to seek the will of God and put it into practice? Absolutely not. But here's the kicker. This is exactly where you were going. That's why I said I've got to move quick here. Remember Luther's explanation of the third article of the Lord's Prayer. We did this in the catechism class. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right? That's the prayer. What does this mean? Luther says, the good and gracious will of God is done indeed without our prayer. The good and gracious will of God is done even without us. Without our help. Can anything prevent God's will from coming to pass? But we pray in this petition that it may be also done among us. Yes, Ruth.
I thought in those days the word prophet meant more like teacher, not future teller. You know, we think
Right,
of prophet
right.
as someone who foretells the future.
Right.
I thought prophet meant teacher.
Yes, and that's exactly what Jonah is here. I mean, he's a prophet, he's a teacher. A prophet was one who was given a word from the Lord. It didn't necessarily mean the future, but it was a word from the Lord that he was supposed to take to the people. And so it may include some future events, it may reference some punishment that God will rain down, but for the most part it was someone who was sent to the people to say, this is what you are doing wrong, and the Lord says you got to stop it. So it was more of a teacher like that. So the Lord wants Jonah to go to Nineveh. He wants his will. His will is that Nineveh be warned because of what they had done. Jonah is trying to thwart that, but God's will is going to be done regardless of what we do. And so even Jonah cannot thwart God's will from happening. And that's part of the message here, that in spite of what Jonah would like to have happen, God's will is going to be done. So even though Jonah runs from it, God takes Jonah's actions and brings a boatload of pagans to faith. Isn't that something? Yeah, I told you at the beginning of this thing, this study is about who? It's about God. And too often we're so worried about the big fish that we forget about the big God. This is the big God. This is how God works. He'll take it when we screw up and make good things happen. That's pretty awesome if you think about it. Pretty doggone awesome. Second deal. What does it say when pagans or non-believers are better at following God's will than we ourselves who believe? What does it say? That a prophet of Yahweh who heard God's voice refuses to follow it, becoming the anti-hero of this story when the pagan sailors actually try to seek and follow God's will. What may this have to do with the proclamation of the gospel? I think it comes back to just what we just said. What is the gospel? What does the gospel say? Come on, I've been preaching this for like 6 or 7 years. Somebody better know what the gospel is. Good news. Why is it good news? What is the good news? What does it say? Absolutely, Jesus Christ. What did he do? What is the good news? He died for us, and we are saved how? By grace, not by what? Not by what we do. So we are what? Ruth said it. Louder, please.
Sinners.
We are sinners, imperfect, incapable, a lot of times, of even doing God's will. But who makes it happen anyways? So we are saved by what? Grace. It's all about who? God. If it were about us, and we were the ones that were doing all the good works, we could say, hey, come be a part of us. Look how good we are. But our job and our proclamation is not to proclaim us, is it? Our job is to proclaim who? Now that is fundamental to me in the life of a congregation and the life of a church. Because if the church is doing a lot of good things, but is not helping people connect with God, we're failing in our mission. Do you see that? And if we're saying, yeah, we're good people, we do a lot of good things, I mean, yeah, great, fantastic. But is it the church's ultimate goal to do good things and make people join the church because the church does good things? Yes or no? The church's ultimate goal is to get people to Jesus. And even if we're doing good things, we've got to be very humble in the midst of that and say, you know, it ain't us. It's God. It's Jesus. That's part of the message here. And so, you know, when we screw up and when we're hypocritical and when we fall down on our faces, I think that's the time where we get to admit, hey, look, it ain't about us. We know we mess up. But it's about God who forgives us in the midst of that. So I think this is a very, very important thing to see in the book of Jonah. That it's about God and it's about God's grace. It's not about whether or not Jonah was perfect, because he certainly wasn't. It's about what God does. So, let me skip that, running out of time. Okay. Here's something. Stewart said this. Aboard ship, after he is awakened to face the storm with the others, Jonah still resists the will of Yahweh. He does not, after all, suggest that the sailors try to row back to shore so that he might now contritely fulfill the command of his God, having learned his lesson. That's the sailor's idea. His solution is death. He would rather face death than participate in a process that would possibly spare Nineveh. He would even die so that the sailors might be spared, but would not preach so that Nineveh might be. The contrast is evident in the way the story is told. The sailors are willing to do whatever Yahweh wants as soon as they find out. Jonah already knows exactly what Yahweh wants, but he tries to escape it. He would rather live in exile or even die than bring favor to the Assyrians. What God wants, Jonah cannot stand to be a part of. This is what I wanted to kind of get to right here when it comes to Jonah and his selfishness of wanting to die. It's not that he's making a noble sacrifice. He still doesn't want to follow Yahweh's will. He still does not want to go to Assyria.
Getting back to the trust, I think he really does believe that Yahweh will save him. He just doesn't want to be any part of it. He's hoping he'll get someone else.
Right? And he would rather die.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to do it. He would rather die, even though he's not going to kill himself. He would rather die than go to those bloody Assyrians, those bloody Ninevites, and give them the opportunity to repent. That's taking it to a whole nother level of selfishness, man. That's taking it to a whole nother level of disobedience. I would rather die than do what God tells me to do. And again, that stark contrast between Jonah and the pagans. Jonah knows what God's will is, and he would rather die. The pagans who don't know God's will are seeking for it and want to follow it, and then they do so. That hurts. That really hurts. Jonah would rather die or live in exile than see some good come to his enemies. He would rather die or live in exile before granting mercy to those whom God wants to show mercy. And he really believes that God will punish him by death. It's what he deserves. It is what he deserves. But here's the deal. We will see whether or not Jonah is crafty enough to escape God. We will see whether or not even this attempt to deny God's will work. Can death prevent God from accomplishing his work through Jonah? And what might be the implications for the answers to that question? So that's where the book takes us next. I don't give you too many spoilers because... Go ahead, Rick. Grab it.
It reminds me of a little trite phrase he's used a lot of times. You can't win, you can't break even, and you can't get out of the game.
That's about the truth. That's about the truth. So anyways, that's what we're going to pick up next week. We're going to see if Jonah is crafty enough to get away from God, supposedly even by death. All right? Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your participation.